Good morning, folks. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for those of you who devoted some of your day to being here. So I'm a philosophy professor at Cal State Fullerton, right up the road. I was born and raised in Fresno, California, and I was growing up during the time of the prison boom in California. Between the years of 1984 and 2004, there were 20 prisons built in California, and only one university. I grew up, and many of those prisons actually exist in the Central Valley where I'm from, and were built during the time that I was during my formative years. And I was struck at a very early age by the way in which the discourse around the prison boom during that time was very much a kind of cost-benefit economic conversation, right? That prison construction was being marketed to folks in my community, sort of struggling agricultural economies that were changing, and it was sold as job stimulus, right? And as an economic stimulus, which always struck me, even as a youth, kind of odd, right? That keeping keeping folks in cages seems to me like a moral problem, and a social kind of issue. Even more than an economic one, although I readily recognize that those are interlinked. And so and I also was raised and went to public schools during a period of time before the concept of the school-to-prison pipeline was really developed. And so in my school, my high school, growing up in Fresno, there were metal detectors that you had to pass through to get into events. There were police officers who worked on campus every day, and so I saw how conflicts that would arise between students, right, students and staff, that that I would later learn, right, that in other contexts, in other kind of suburban contexts, where such conflicts would be dealt with internally, right, with measures like mediation, right, or detention, or suspension, or even expulsion. When law enforcement agents have a presence on campus, many of those conflicts in my high school and elsewhere would be dealt with through criminal justice measures, right? And this has become such a prevalent part of the effects of quote-unquote zero-tolerance policies during the 1980s and 90s. And early 2000s, that it's been sort of conceptually demarcated as the school-to-prison pipeline, right? Ways in which the criminalization, right, of conflicts within communities leads to the growth of incarceration in the U.S. So that's just a little bit of, and so I sort of saw that firsthand and was and also saw that a lot of my peers were either, kind of participating in illicit drug economies, or preparing themselves for employment in corrections, in law enforcement, right? And so many of the dynamics of what I'm going to call, following Angela Davis and others, the prison industrial complex, I started kind of noticing but not having concepts or histories to really understand when I was a youth, right? And so one of the things that philosophy and other philosophy, but also history and ethnic studies disciplines in college, one of the things that they provided me were just a fleet of concepts and histories to really kind of explain phenomena and to explain the world that I had sort of encountered and dealt with, and from which questions and problems arose and perplexities arose. And I really think that that's much of the root of philosophy. We get a bad rap for just like, thinking pie in the sky abstractly or about questions that aren't engaged in the world, and that's not at all what philosophy grows out of, or what it's particularly adept at least as far as I'm concerned. And so I will say a few things about the work that I'm doing at Cal State Fullerton. One of the things that I love about Cal State Fullerton is that we have a very, sort of engaged, we have faculty who do engaged philosophy. So a lot of the sort of systems change work. So I'm going to do some theoretical stuff. I'm going to talk to you a bit about some concepts and some history. And then I'll end by talking about some of the systems change work that I'm engaged in at the at Cal State Fullerton and in the CSU. And those two, the philosophical side of that and the sort of practical, if you will, side of that, although I think that dichotomy is often a false one, they're very interlinked, right? And I'm blessed, I'll say, in many respects, to have found a place at Cal State Fullerton where my colleagues immediately, most of them anyway, see the philosophical significance of the systems change work and the way that the systems change work influences philosophical analysis and vice versa. Okay, so that by way of introduction, I'm going to talk to you a bit today about the philosophy of abolition, transforming the university into a vehicle of decarceration. In order to do that, I have to say something about abolition. In order to do that, I have to say something about the prison industrial complex. And then that will sort of build toward me giving you a sense of the kind of work that we're doing in the CSU system. And I can also speak to some systems change that's happening in the community college system around issues of building pathways, higher educational pathways for folks with criminal records, for formerly incarcerated folks. So this is a chart that displays to you the total U.S. incarcerated population from 1910 until 2015. And what do you notice?
Rapid increase, right there. That was during the Reagan years.
Even before, yeah. It really ramps up during the Reagan years, and the war on drugs really ramps up during the 80s. But even, 1973, basically every minute of every hour from 1973 until about 2016, the incarceration, the number of folks incarcerated was increasing, and as you can see, increasing at an exponential rate, right? But then, so there's an exponential kind of jump here at 1973, but then what about before that?
You had folks that were genuinely violent offenders, but then this war on drugs came in, which was kind of a ridiculous thing. It's just a way to segregate people into the upper class and the lower class. But my question for you is, what is the economic as well as the social cost of all this? This must be costing a tremendous amount of money to incarcerate these folks.
Yeah, so a great question, and that's exactly where I'm headed. So there's a lot of analysis in your response that we could certainly dive into, and some of the economics we'll definitely dive into. But just in terms of just the facts that shout out from this chart, if we've got a spike from 1973 till 2016, before that, what are we looking at? By contrast, relatively stable. I mean, not huge. We've got some movement here, but everything, is under 500,000, right? So the question is, and statistics are great for eliminating bad explanations. They're not so great at generating, at isolating and identifying the right sorts of explanations. But this is a big question, right? What has happened, right, in this period of time to explain this? And one thing that is not an explanation, right, is something like population growth or something like crime rate escalation. Sociologists for a long time have been in agreement about the evidence that crime rates and incarceration rates, they don't match up in any intelligible way, right? So a lot of this is policy driven, right? But we'll say a little bit about some of the background for that. So when you step back a little bit and look not just at those who are incarcerated in jails and prisons at the county, state, and federal levels, but also folks who are on parole or probation, the number of folks incarcerated goes almost up to 7 million, right? In the state of California, 1 out of every 5 people has a criminal conviction, right? So it's these sorts of numbers, right, that folks are referring to with the concept of mass incarceration. So we, in the United States, have 5% of the global population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population, right? So we incarcerate more of the people in our country than not only any other country on the planet, but any other country, you know, in the history of, in human history, right? And California, right, to bring things home, California, we often like to think of ourselves as our own country here, you know? And if we were to do that for a moment, California has the 3rd largest prison system of any country in the world, right? Behind the US as a whole, which holds the #1 spot, and China, which holds the #2 spot. That's for just sheer numbers, right? And does anyone know what the population of China is?
1.6 billion.
Okay, does anyone know what the population of California is?
38 million.
Okay, so good. So just rough, I mean, you know, boom, we got it. So in sheer numbers, so we're competing with the likes of China, right, for the sheer volume of folks that we incarcerate. So all of which is just to say we are an aberration from global norms about, you know, sort of comparably developed democracies and whatnot. We're an aberration, not, you know, an exception, not consistent with global norms around this. So this is just a chart that demonstrates that a little bit for you. The U.S. incarceration rate is 600. This is how sociologists and criminologists calculate this sort of thing. It's the number. The rate is the number per 100,000 in the population, and so you see the U.S. there is up there. So this is not sheer numbers, volume, but the rate. So relative to the size of the population of the country, the rate at which they. And even on that front, right, the U.S. Is the leader at 670. Russia is next in line at 439, and then Rwanda at 434. And then if you get, you know, like our neighbors to the north, right, are at 114. Spain, 129, right? So again, you know, we're an aberration from global norms. And then, so someone mentioned, and I think I also made mention of the war on drugs, which is a factor, you know, not the only factor, but certainly a factor in any conversation about, any explanatory conversation about mass incarceration. What you're seeing here, and the Sentencing Project is a great research think tank run out of DC that you know, basically they just sift through Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics research and generate, you know, really readily intelligible reports about phenomena that are happening in the criminal justice system. Yes, go ahead.
Are any of the stats broken down ethnically at all?
I'll be right there in just a second. Yeah. So this displays the number of people in prisons and jails for drug offenses. In 1980, that's the gray one, versus 2015, which is the green one. And so split out at the county level in jails, the federal level, right, and in state prisons. So basically, you'll get the visual tendency here, right? You begin with a series of statistical charts to kind of just give folks a sense for the scope and scale of the problem, and all of the charts just kind of have this kind of characteristic, right? But certainly the war on drugs is a significant entry into the explanatory equation. But then this is the number of folks who are serving life sentences. So 96% of folks who go to prison will eventually come out, right? But this is the number of folks who are serving life sentences. Some of those are life sentences without the possibility of parole. Some of those are life sentences where folks actually will have the opportunity to get paroled. But you can see again from 1984 to 2012, that number has gone up substantially. And then when you look at the states with the most people who are serving life sentences, here we are, California, right? With the dubious distinction, right, of leading the pack in this respect, right? 3 strikes laws have a major part major explanatory part to do with this. And then to address the question that you posed, right? Mass incarceration is a racialized phenomenon, right? Which is to say it doesn't impact specific racial groups proportionally, all right, or equally, right? So I had shown you the rates of incarceration by different countries on the planet. That's a general rate, right? This is those incarceration rates differentiated by their impact on specific racial or ethnic communities, right? So when you look at the incarceration rate among whites is 380 out of 100,000, right? Which is still double the incarceration rate in Canada, right? But then when you look at Latinos, it's 966, right? And then when you look at black folks, it's 2,207 per every 100,000, right? So this is what in the literature we call racial disparity, right? Racially disparate outcomes in the criminal justice system. And again, there are all kinds of empirical questions and philosophical questions, social theoretical questions about what what causes that, right? But these are just empirical facts about the state of affairs, right? So this visualizes for you the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment in the United States. Again, now here broken out by both race and gender. And as you can see, there are many more men incarcerated than women, although women are the fastest growing sector of the incarcerated population. And California incarcerates more women than any other place on the planet. Again, another dubious distinction that we enjoy here in California. But it's also, as you can see, very racially disparate. So the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for Latino men is 1 in 6, and the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for black men is 1 in 3, right? So highly, racially disparate outcomes. Okay, so this is Angela Davis, a philosopher. She's an emeritus professor from UC Santa Cruz, where she was in a department, an interdisciplinary department called the History of Consciousness. And wouldn't you like to be, in a department with a name like the History of Consciousness, right? Very interdisciplinary department, but a philosopher by training, right? And she has a powerful little book called Are Prisons Obsolete? And another powerful little book that came out, so Are Prisons Obsolete, which is part of an extract that I have for you in your handout. That was published in 2000. Abolition Democracy was published in 2005. And so now I'm going to, so I've given you a sense for the phenomenon of mass incarceration, right? Now, what I want to, following Angela Davis, I want to make the claim that that mass incarceration, right, signifies a symptom, right, of what I call the unfinished project of American abolition, right? So abolition typically, when you hear of abolition, what do you typically think of? I hear some horror.
The African-American experience, well, it was, at first, abolitionists were African-American, but then there were like John Brown, who was a radical white abolitionist. There was no longer going to be a discussion about slavery and abolition. He took direct action and was executed for it.
Good. Okay. So yeah. So abolition typically conjures up, right, images of those who are resisting the institution of slavery, right? That's its origin, right? And certainly it was abolition in the 19th century and 18th century were certainly movements that were impossible without valiant efforts on the part of African Americans, some freed, some enslaved, right? And also multiracial coalitions, right? So this is part of the analysis that I'm going to share with you begins with slavery, right? So Angela Davis makes the following claim: slavery as an institution during the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century managed to become a receptacle for all those forms of punishment that were considered to be too barbaric by the developing American democracy. So rather than abolish the death penalty outright, it was offered refuge within slave law. This meant that white people were eventually released from the threat of death for most offenses, with murder remaining as the usual offense leading to a white's execution. Black slaves, on the other hand, were subject to the death penalty in some states for as many as 70 different offenses. One might say that the institution of slavery served as a receptacle for those forms of punishment considered too uncivilized to be inflicted on white citizens within a democratic society, right? Okay, so slavery, the system of slavery as a receptacle, right, for barbaric forms of punishment. She then says the prison system continues to carry out this terrible legacy, right? So we have an argument here about continuity, right? Or, you know, what I like to say, persistence through permutation. Doesn't mean identity across history, but a persistence through different kinds of permutations, right, of parallel phenomena, right? The prison system continues to carry out this terrible legacy. It has become a receptacle for all those human beings who bear the inheritance of the failure to create abolition democracy in the aftermath of slavery. And this inheritance is not only borne by black prisoners, but also by poor Latino, Native American, Asian, and white prisoners, right? So this idea that the prison system functions as a receptacle, right, in a way that's parallel, right, to the way that the institution of slavery served as a receptacle for forms, right, of treatment that in general civilized, you know, in civil society, we would more or less would be met with moral objection, right? But when they transpire in the exceptional space of the prison, they're met with, you know, they're acceptable, right? So, like, you know, the one example of this, right, is rape, right? And how many times have you heard a stand-up comedian or anybody make a flippant, you know, kind of joke about dropping the soap in prison, right? So that's a normalization of sexual violation that I would hope, right, in civil society is generally has a degree of consensus, right, of moral objection to it as a practice. But in the space, right, of the prison, it's the subject of, you know, it's acceptable and normalized and and such. Oh yeah, thank you. Oops. All right, thanks. Thank you. Okay, so this is the text of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Part of the Reconstruction Amendments ratified in the wake of the conclusion of the Civil War, right, in 1865. So this is the amendment to the Constitution credited with abolishing slavery in the United States. And what do you notice about the text of this amendment? I'm going to give someone else an opportunity, but I'm glad that you're so engaged.
Can be used as a punishment?
Yeah. There's a loophole, right? There's a legal loophole here, right? There's an exceptional clause, right? So, in effect, the 13th Amendment, it didn't abolish slavery, right? It codified it, right, or you know, relocated it into this one exceptional place, right? Namely, that involuntary servitude has no place in the U.S. except as punishment for crime whereof a party shall have been duly convicted. This is the only place in the Constitution where crime is even mentioned, right? So, in the founding document of American democracy, slavery and crime are conceptually linked. And I think this is very significant, right? And I think, so when I talk with Angela Davis and others about abolition, right? I'm talking about prison abolition and using that terminology very advisedly to resonate, right, with abolitionist movements of prior eras, because the kind of injustice that the current system of mass incarceration symbolizes, in my view, is evidence, right, of persistence through permutations, right, of forms of racial inequity that have been with us, right, for many, many years. And scholars and activists have been successful in raising consciousness around these issues over the last 20 years to such an extent that someone like Ava DuVernay has made a documentary called 13th. Has anyone seen 13th? Okay, one or two people. You can stream it on Netflix. It came out in 2015, and it's very good, right, in many respects, and charts out some of these connections between that legal loophole in the 13th Amendment and its iterations and manifestations into the present. So just to give you a sort of sense for this shift, right, what you're seeing here are the average percentage of incarcerated folks in southern states by race during various years in the 19th century, so basically before the Civil War, right? So before the Civil War, before the 13th Amendment, what do you notice about the racial composition of prisons in southern states? Overwhelmingly white, right? Overwhelmingly white, yeah. So this is the number of prisoners in Georgia's penitentiary by race from 1871 to 1909, right? So these are the 30 years or so following the Civil War, following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and what do you notice? Okay, it goes from total reversal, right? And I will say to you that Georgia in this instance is not exceptional among southern states in this period of time, but representative, right? Representative. And so during this period of time, you have this shift toward the southern states employing the criminal justice system, right, as a mechanism for reconstituting, right, a system of racial inequality, and for generating a source of free labor, right? And during this period of time, in fact, in southern states, prisons functioned as convict leasing systems, right? Which is effectively the state would incarcerate folks. Largely during this period of time, black codes were more or less copied and pasted from one southern state to another in terms of modifying their criminal codes. And vagrancy, right, was criminalized really intensively during this period of time. And one of the things that emancipated African Americans were exercising, right, as their newfound liberty of mobility, right, to move, right, and not be confined to one to a plantation, right, but also having had generations, right, of family members whose entire laboring lives, right, were devoted toward increasing the value of southern plantations, right? So without means of which to speak, and so vagrancy, right, being out past curfew after 10 o'clock, right, or not having a job, right? In Georgia, if you didn't have a job at the beginning of the year, you would be rounded up and incarcerated, and then your labor would be leased out by the state, right, for say $200 a year to the railroad industry, right, in public works, but sometimes to the very same plantations on which folks had been confined prior to the Civil War, right? So this now moving forward to the period between 1950 and 2008. This is the incarceration in state and federal prisons and local jails per 100,000 by race. This is a condensed kind of period, but then we have here that growth period from the 1970s, right? So similarly, right, highly racialized phenomenon that disproportionately affects black folks. So just to look, so there was a question about economic features of this, right? State expenditures, right, on criminal justice have increased astronomically, whether it's police expenditures, judicial and legal expenditures, or prison expenditures. Back in 1980, we were spending about $25 billion per year, right, on these sorts of things. This chart only goes up to 2006, but it's increased, and certainly in the state of California, it's continued to increase over the last 10 years. We're above $250 billion nationally, right? This shows you criminal justice system employment, right? So a lot of folks, when we think about the prison industrial complex, right, which is more or less a concept for trying to articulate ways in which the criminal justice system is embedded in networks of profit making. A lot of folks think, oh, private prisons, right? And that's significant and important to think about, because private prisons are just straightforward, kind of historical reiterations of the convict lease system, which is that you've got corporations who are getting per diem payments for every body that's in a bed in their facility, right? But private prisons are constitute only 10% of the number, of folks incarcerated in the U.S. But in public prisons are just as much embedded, right, in networks of profit making as private prisons, and in different ways, right? But one of the ways is just civil service, right? Each and every prison represents millions of dollars, right, of construction contracts, right? They're small cities, right? So there are all kinds of services that prisons need, and all kinds of employees, right? So it's been a major sector of civil service employment growth over the period of that boom, right? So this just kind of visualizes that for you. The national criminal justice system employment during those 25 years. And you can see the employment in the law enforcement, judicial and legal and correction sector, going up significantly. So to bring this closer to home, this is a community college, and the community college system has a funding stream which is separate from the funding streams that the California State University and University of California systems draw from. And good for you, because it's a much more stable source of income. The CSU and the UC basically have to go to the legislature and the governor every single year and say, give me some money, right? And that money comes from the general fund, right? And that general fund is a huge pot of tax revenue, and it funds a number of different public agencies. For our purposes, the two agencies that draw their budgets from that pool of funds are the CSU and UC systems, right? So those two systems of higher ed, and the Department of Corrections, right? So they come from the same pool of revenue. And adjusted for inflation, if you look at the change in general fund expenditures between 1980 and 2012, you'll notice that higher education expenditures have gone down by 13%, right? Whereas expenditures on prisons have gone up 436%, right? So I always say to my students at Cal State Fullerton, I ask, so what percentage of Cal State Fullerton's operating budget do you think came from state revenues? Or do you think comes from state revenues right now? Just throw out a guess.
Like a percentage?
Yeah, percentage. What percentage of Cal State Fullerton's, the operating budget, what it costs to run a university that serves 40,000 students, 4,000 staff, right? What percentage would you? It's a comprehensive public university. 50%. All right. 3%. Okay. All right. So in 1985, it was 75%. Right now, it's 33%. Right. So we're educating more and more students, right? And so where does that revenue come from? Where's the difference in, we got to make up those costs somehow, right? It doesn't cost, what's that? Tuition. That's a major source, right? Grants, contracts, and philanthropy and all that stuff, but tuition, right? Tuition at Cal State Fullerton doubled between 2004 and 2008, right? And that's not, there are, I'm totally unbiased about this, but there are high-quality faculty at Cal State Fullerton, right? High-quality faculty. But that tuition jump does not give students more high-quality faculty or more classes, right? I like to say that, folks are paying for prisons, right? So just to give one further example, right, of the way in which higher education and the prison industrial complex in the state of California are linked together, this is a screenshot from the California Prison Industry Authority, right, which is a part of the Department of Corrections, which bills itself as running like a for-profit institution, and it employs folks incarcerated in the state of California to do a host of different things, right? One of which is furniture manufacture. That is the desk in my faculty office, right? In fact, every single item of furniture in my office is manufactured by the hands of folks who are incarcerated in the state of California. The bookshelves, the desk, my chair, everything, right? And this is the case across the Cal State Fullerton and across the CSU. And the reason for this is that from 1985 until 2005, the CSU and the UC system and other state agencies, including the DMV, right, all kinds of states, were legislatively mandated to purchase any items that they needed, that the California Prison Industry Authority produced. We were legislatively mandated to purchase them from the California Prison Industry Authority, right? So you probably can't see it from where you're at, but the price of this desk, $860, right? And I promise you see that drawer right there? I've never been able to get that thing open, ever. Ever. I don't know what's in there. I mean, hopefully there's not, a dead animal in there or something like that, right? But in any case, clearly I could get a higher quality desk, right, at a lower price point, right, if I went on the open market. But as a captive consumer and a captive labor force, right, you can see, and so I might think to myself, okay, well maybe that's really providing solid wages, and benefits to the folks inside who are manufacturing this stuff. And that's, as you might expect, not the case. Folks who are employed by the California Prison Industry Authority are making between 13 cents and $1.15 an hour. 13 cents and $1.15 an hour, right? So when we're looking at this, right, which is the change in budgetary priorities, like between higher education and prisons, right, and I think one of the adages from Joe Biden that I think is worth repeating is that you want to show me what your values are, like show me your budget, right? Where you put your money, right, will really be symbolic of what you value, like what's important to you, right? And in the state of California, this is the kind of stuff that makes me a little bit concerned, right? But when you look at this, though, even some of that higher education money through the back door is still going back into prisons, right? So that's an example of two public institutions, public prisons and public universities, right, in a relationship, right, that is producing. I mean, you say profits, but where do the profits from the California Prison Industry Authority go? They go back into corrections, right? They go back into the corrections budget, right? So there aren't, like there are with private prisons, stockholders who are earning dividends or anything like that. But it's still, right? It's statecraft, right? It's still the production, of a sector of a civil service economy. Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned from 1985 to 2005
Mm-hmm.
was legislative break, but what happened in 2005?
Great. So when I arrived at Cal State Fullerton, I was like, okay, I'm sure that there are ways in which the institution in which I am connected, right, in which I'm embedded, is connected to the phenomena that I'm studying. And so I hunted down, right, procurement contracts, right, in the university, and that's when I learned about this this code of the education policy, which is tied to the criminal code, right. And then I asked the procurement office, right. I asked for a breakdown of all the costs, so how much has Cal State Fullerton. What's the cost of the contracts that they've had with the Prison Industry Authority? And it's fun. Whenever you make an inquiry like that, they have to, by law, honor the inquiry and get back to you, right? And then they're like, okay, well, we've produced the documents for you, and you got to come by, but you got to pay 10 cents a page for producing the documents. And it was like 3 pages, right, of a spreadsheet. So I just walked over there with 30 cents, Anyway, it was kind of quaint. But so it was in the course of that inquiry that I learned that the CSU has been exempt from that legislative mandate since 2005. And you could see, right, with procurement officers in a fiscal scenario where they have to make hard choices and be efficient with their budgets, you can imagine if you're a procurement officer facing those kinds of costs, you're probably going to apply some pressure. Be like, why do we have to pay this? When our budgets are, for what we have to do are already going down. So as you might expect, the spending at Cal State Fullerton with CalPIA has gone gone down since then. But the CSU is exempt from that legislative mandate. That legislative mandate still is in place for the Department of Department of Motor Vehicles, right? For the Department of Corrections, right? And for other state agencies, right? Great question. Okay, because we're getting close to time when I want to really engage more closely with you all. So in the last in the last fiscal budget for the state, even though something happened in 2012 called Realignment, right, where effectively, in short, the Supreme Court of the United States knocked on the door of the state of California and said, to exist in a state prison in the state of California is to have your Eighth Amendment rights against cruel and unusual punishment violated. Because the state of California was at 180, the prison system in the state of California was at 187% capacity. 187% capacity. So the Supreme Court just basically said, you know, this is a quote from one of the justices, it is uncontested fact that someone needlessly dies in the state prison system in California every week due to deficiencies in the medical delivery system within the state prison related to, you know, what's called overcrowding, right? And so the Supreme Court was just like, we don't care how you do it, but you have to, you know, reduce the number of folks who are in your state prisons. Now that presents a whole host of policy problems. You know, it's like, well, we can build more prisons, right? Or we can, you know, we can decarcerate folks, or we can change criminal codes and, you know, change prosecuting patterns. You can do a whole host of things. What the state of California did was called realignment, right? Which is to say, take a whole host of a whole category of offenses, which they called nonviolent, non-sexual, non-serious crimes. The 3 nons is what they called them, right? And for those folks, right, instead of doing time in the state prison system, those folks would do their time at the county level, in county jails, right? Jails typically are places where folks, if you aren't familiar, where folks awaiting trial are detained, right? Or folks who are doing less than a year of a sentence. So this transformed the way that, you know, the relationship between the state and county correction systems in the state operated. And it basically just kicked the problem to the counties, right? Like, you decide, right, how you're going to, and some counties decided to build bigger prisons. In fact, the majority did. And some, you know, came up with alternative sorts of measures, right? But in any case, when I mentioned that when we were looking at that curve, and I said since 2016 there's been a kind of plateauing, in California the number of folks incarcerated has gone down, right, as a result of realignment and some of these policy changes, right? Again, not related to crime rates, but related to policy changes, right? But nevertheless, even with that decline, slight decline in the number of folks incarcerated in California, the average that the state spends per person per year continues to grow, right? Continues to grow. And so in the 2017 fiscal year, it cost $75,560 on average to keep a person in a cage for a year in the California state prison system, right? So that's more than Harvard tuition, you know what I mean, right? And so just as a sort of thought experiment, which we like to do in philosophy, right? If we were just to say, you know, empty California prisons today, right, and enter them and fully pay their tuition, right, in the California State University, right? This is the University of California, but their tuition is a little bit more than this, so it really means the California State University. We'd save about $7 billion a year, right? Because it's about, you know, $7,500 tuition. At the Cal State, right? And so to end, I'll say that part of what we're doing, so the systems change piece of the work that I do, relates to a program called Project Rebound. And what we do at Project Rebound is try and create a pathway for folks from the criminal justice system into higher education, right? And so what we do is we, you know, so now I'm going to point your attention to the handout that I gave you. And it has 2 sides, and the back side really just tells you about the mission and values and goals of Project Rebound. And the front side, you know, one of the things that the I gleaned from faculty when I was a student was really to get a sense from really reflective and thoughtful people, like what are the problems which really perplex them, and what were the sorts of issues, that, like really complicated problems that cause folks to, require a whole lot of thought. And one thing that I would look to in classes is to have some of those golden nuggets just sort of dropped into my lap, right? Like here's a problem that I could really think about. And when I'm teaching classes, I try to give students a sense that this is a problem that is so complicated and so multifaceted and multi-layered that we could spend a really long time just thinking about it. We're not going to because our time is limited, but you could devote your life to this, right? So in any case, the passage on your handout is one passage in Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, which as a philosopher who's working in this arena and as someone who's actively engaged in advocacy efforts and systems change efforts around mass incarceration, this is the passage that I continually return to try and think like what it would require, right, to actually reach abolitionist goals of removing the prison industrial complex from our society. And I'll let you sort of look at that in your own time. But I will point to a couple of things about it, which is that if we, so abolition is not a short-term strategy. I'm not suggesting that we just empty, right, every prison and jail, right, immediately, right? It's a long-term goal, right? Not a short-term one. But it's also not just a project of tearing down, right, the institutions that you and I would identify as prisons and jails, but it's also a constructive project of actually building the kinds of institutions and building the kinds of relationships that would, that weren't built in the wake of formal abolition in 1865, but that we could build to actually address the social problems that the criminal justice system has grown to address, right? Which are not the sorts of problems which the criminal justice system or law enforcement are particularly well suited, right, to actually solve, right? And yet we are exhausting precisely the public wealth and social resources that we might employ to address issues of homelessness, right, undereducation, right, unemployment, right, drug addiction, right, domestic violence, right? The host of problems which lead folks onto the track and pathway that leads them to prison. We could be employing those resources to address those problems, right? In ways that would actually allow us to think about what a world without where the default response to those kinds of social problems is to disappear the people who represent the social problems rather than to grapple with the social problems. But one of the things that Davis says here is that we need to let go of the desire to discover one single alternative system of punishment that would occupy the same footprint as the prison system. Instead, we need to think about a constellation of alternative strategies, right? So any alternative to the prison system which occupies the same footprint is still just going to be another prison, right? So this thinking about creating a constellation of alternative strategies that has the ultimate aim, right, of crowding out the prison from our social and psychic landscapes. And she drops this one little claim at the bottom of the handout there. Schools are the most powerful alternative to jails and prisons. To abolish prisons, we would have to transform schools into vehicles of decarceration, right? And that's what we're trying to do with Project Rebound, right? So one of the values, so our values in Project Rebound, if you just flip over, the second value, right, is that public resources are better invested in education and other opportunities for transformation than prisons and punishment, right? The social wealth, claim that I was making earlier. And then this is key. The integration and leadership of formerly incarcerated people is essential to the work of creating solutions to the social crisis of mass incarceration. I believe the people who are closest to the problem hold the seeds of the solution, right? So at Project Rebound, you know, we have our program coordinator, right? Our student employees, our housing coordinator, because we now have a housing initiative that's part of Project Rebound at Cal State Fullerton, the first in the nation to provide reentry housing for university students. All of these folks are folks who have traveled that trajectory, who have done time in prison and have come out, have navigated institutions of higher education, earned their degrees, and are now reaching back with credibility, right, to assist and mentor and create a sort of mentorship feedback loop so that folks who are coming out can succeed and have higher education be a part of their transition, right? So Project Rebound was started at San Francisco State in 1967 by a guy named John Irwin, who did 5 years in the state prison system for armed robbery. Upon his release, he got a bachelor's degree from UCLA and a PhD from Berkeley, and became a world-renowned researcher on prisons at San Francisco State, where he's a sociology professor. And he started Project Rebound out of the closet of the sociology department there, just as a mechanism for matriculating folks from the prison system into the California State University system. So fast forward to 2012, I had arrived at Fullerton and was just sort of doing landscape studies among grassroots organizations and organizations led by formerly incarcerated folks, trying to figure out like what were the needs, right? What could an institution of higher education, you know, do to meet some of those needs? And it wasn't very long before I found Project Rebound at San Francisco State. I was like, this is great. They've got a great track record of success, you know, small program, but a long history, you know. And so we were able in 2016 to expand Project Rebound to 9 CSU campuses, including Cal State Fullerton. We're at Cal State LA and Cal Poly Pomona. There's a program that's growing at Cal State Long Beach. And so I'm involved at the systems level to try and, you know, persuade the legislature, right, that this is something that should be publicly, you know, that should be part of the mission of the CSU, because the scale of mass incarceration in the state of California is of such a magnitude, as you can see, that I think one of the other things that we have are the largest systems of higher education in the country, right? So I think the community college system, the Cal State system, and the UC system, these are you know, systems in place that I think can provide, you know, one of the only scalable kinds of solutions, right, to the scale of the problem in the state of California. And in any case, we are doing that work and enjoying a great deal of success, which I'm happy to talk about in greater detail for those who are interested. But in any case, thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to, you know, hearing more from you about your questions and concerns. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Question: does your research factor in juvenile offenders in juvenile hall, because they also are a pipeline to the jails and prisons? Does it deal with that at all?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, part of the, you know, part of the prison to pipeline phenomenon that I was alluding to earlier when I was talking autobiographically about my experience is that, you know, during the 80s and 90s across the country, right, a shift toward the increasing presence of law enforcement on certain public school campuses, right, really contributed, right, to youth getting funneled into the criminal justice system. And once you have a record, right, then, you know, your exposure and your vulnerability, right, to further criminal justice system contact goes up precipitously, right? And then rates of academic completion, right, go down, right? So we know this now. We've got a lot of, you know, data to substantiate it. And in the state of California, we've enjoyed some recent, you know, some recent policy victories in this arena, right? For particularly youth. Because there has been, right, you know, during the period of that growth, a tendency across the country to try youth as adults, right, to impose the sentences, right, and processes of adult criminal justice onto youth, right? What we have known for some time, but is now finally, I think, influencing some policymakers, right? Is that I made some terrible decisions when I was a youth, right? But I also enjoyed a series of unearned privileges, right? That I could identify, right? That my body was not policed in the same way that some of my friends, who were friends of color, right? Whose bodies were policed in different ways, right? So, but in any case, I made a lot of poor decisions, right? Some of which broke laws, right? But I managed to keep a clean record, right? And keep my, my health, right? Which other folks who I knew as a youth didn't have that opportunity. But what we now know is that, brains are developing, right? Into early 20s, right? And the kinds of, deliberative capacities, right, that a 17-year-old, right, is able to enjoy versus a 30-year-old, they're significant, right? And so that psychological research is starting to influence criminal justice processes for treating youth as adults, and so that's a major part of it. A number of the students in our program are folks who were tried as adults when they were youth, given life sentences, right, and are now trying to pursue the path of education that they would have wanted for themselves, right, back when they were youth but didn't have the pathways, right, or communal support or what have you to pursue. But that's certainly it's a major part, right. The criminalization of youth is a major part of the phenomenon of mass incarceration. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, concerns, experiences? Yeah.
In Davis's passage, it says,
Yeah.
let go of the desire to discover one single alternative system of punishment.
Yeah.
How does one go by changing the perspective of the majority of the population, not just in California, but maybe in the United States, that we so easily say, oh, this person made his choice or made her choice, let him rot in prison or whatever. How do we change the perspective of millions of people to be able to focus on education instead of punishment?
Yeah, that's that's part of social science, a question for a social scientist, partially a question for a marketing specialist, right? But I think so. But I'll say this, right? One of the things that we do at Rebound is not only support students, right, by helping them navigate higher education and the large, the small city that Cal State campuses are, and help them get connected to financial aid resources, help them with the application process, even while they're still inside. You serve as a hub to connect them to resources on campus, right? Advocate for them in various ways. But one thing that we also do is give folks a platform if they want to. We honor the folks who want to fly under the radar, but increasingly, as we've done our work, folks have come out of the shadows, right? We provide folks opportunities to define themselves, right? To share their narratives, right? And to speak and to contribute to rendering more complicated, right? Public discussions around criminal justice and higher education, right? So last week we did 4 presentations, right? Before the student government at Cal State Fullerton, before 10 legislative staffers from Sacramento, before the Board of Trustees for a local foundation. And at every single one of those presentations, it was me, my program coordinator, right, who did 20 years in prison before earning a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and 2 students, right? And so the sort of quality narratives, right, are part of what changes hearts and minds, right? Because, an example of this is when you're out at a party and a friend is, say, too drunk to drive, what do? Do you call the police? Yeah, there it is, man. You don't call the police, right? You take their keys, right? And why do you take their keys instead of call the police?
Well, they're not drinking and driving yet, but you want to prevent that.
Good. So you want to prevent harm to your friend and to others who your friend might inadvertently harm, right? So you're trying to prevent harm. It's a harm prevention strategy, but one that's not, punitive, right? So, but why do you do that? So you do it. So why do you choose rather? Both are harm prevention strategies, right? But why choose taking the keys rather than calling the police in this instance? Yeah, so you love them, right? You care about them. They're human to you, right? Which means they're worthy of a kind of investment, right? And you don't want them to be in a cage. They're making a bad choice, and you want to intervene. You know, maybe the next day you're going to say, yo, man, you know, like you reached your limits. You know, maybe there's some education piece, or if it's a chronic problem, like some intervention, right? These are the sorts of mediation strategies and harm prevention strategies that we are very accustomed to engaging in when it's members of our community. But we need to be able to extend that kind of care, right, to those who are outside of our community, right? So part of it, and so giving folks, Rebound students, for instance, the opportunity to be not just a Department of Corrections number or statistic, right, but to be, you know, JC, right, to be a name, to be a person, right, and to share their narrative, and to also break down a false choice, a false dichotomy that we have in our country about victims and perpetrators, right? Because the vast majority of folks who are incarcerated are also themselves survivors of various kinds of violence, whether that be domestic violence, sexual violence, right? So, and that's really important, right? Because and I mentioned this student because he's just in my mind at the moment, JC, and he says, hurt people, right? Which is that you talk to anybody, right, who, for instance, you know, has done time for some kind of violent offense, and I guarantee you, right, the rate at which people with those convictions have themselves been, you know, survivors of various kinds of violence is very high, right, upwards of 70%, right. So that's part of, you know, and so seeing folks who can, you know, seeing folks who have done harm as themselves also having been harmed, right? And also seeing the harm that prisons inflict. Because everybody who's coming out of prison has post-traumatic stress disorder. Because they're intrinsically, you know, coercive institutions, right? So seeing that, right, that's part of the, you know, that's part of the answer, you know, to like changing hearts and minds, and really, you know, why would we deploy a set of like public health kinds of resources to the issue of drug addiction rather than policing, right? In the 80s and 90s, the drug epidemics, right, were treated as moral problems, not as public health problems. Fortunately, not exhaustively, but increasingly, there's been a paradigm shift policy-wise as we've started to approach those things, right, as public health problems, which deploy a whole different set of public resources and agencies and you know, credentialed, you know, officials and things like that, right? Versus, you know, claiming it as a moral problem and deploying law enforcement and criminal justice sort of resources for. So, yeah, that's part of how I would answer that. Let's in the back and then back up to the front. Yeah.
Kind of a long question of sorts.
Sure.
To do with my own experience. Apparently, there's a funding source that's come up, and this is within the system. It doesn't get you out of the system of paying for community college tuition for students to become students in the incarcerated, especially in the not just the prison, but the correctional, the ones that call correctional institutions.
Yes.
That they get free. You know, in other words, they don't have to pay the normal price for community college classes, and they also get access to checking out pads where they can get their textbooks free too. And I think that was passed in 2016. And I don't know where the funding source comes from.
Yeah.
But it does have the advantage of, like, at least one person actually wrote an interesting paper on it from one of the prisons that said that those people that actually achieve a goal, and even in prison, of a degree, or at least heading towards a degree, their recidivism rate goes way down from those who don't.
So the recidivism is the way that sociologists and criminologists talk about the rate at which folks who are released from prison go back to prison, right? And so in the state of California, there's a 1-year and a 3-year way of measuring the recidivism. And in the state of California, the recidivism rate is around 64%, which means 64% of folks released from California state prisons go back to prison within 3 years, right? And as so, like, if 64% of my students failed my classes, right? You know, like, I would be a total failure. You know what I mean? It's like, if that's your metric of success, the criminal justice system is, you know, is woefully failing, right? But this is, as you know, I mean, you may be surprised to learn, this is about what it is nationally. California doesn't, you know, isn't distinctive in this respect, right? So Project Rebound students are, so our program's only 2 years old, so that, you know, relativizes the statistical significance of our pool, right? But our recidivist rate is 3% right now. San Francisco's program, which has been running for 50 years, 10%, right? So it's certainly, you know, and a study, the RAND Institute ran a study about correctional education and found that for every dollar invested in education for folks who are incarcerated, the state, you know, saves $5 in corrections costs, right? Due in part to, right, the impact that it has on the lives of incarcerated folks. But so you mentioned SB 1391, right, which was passed in 2014. Some background to that, which is in 1996, the crime bill of 96, one of its impacts was to eliminate the eligibility of incarcerated people from federal Pell Grants, right? So overnight, right, there were hundreds of college programs in prisons throughout the country, and overnight they closed their doors, right? Because there was no, because almost all of their students, right, were receiving Pell Grants. Now, of the overall pool of Pell Grant recipients, right, incarcerated folks were about 2%, right? So a small segment of the overall pool of folks receiving Pell Grants, but nevertheless, that was the mechanism by which folks were able to have access to higher education, right? In 1996, that dropped, right? And the only programs that survived were ones who had philanthropic support, right? So in 2014, when SB 1391 passed, there was one face-to-face credit-bearing college program in the California state prison system, the Prison University Project at San Quentin. And there was one CSU, you know, Project Rebound, right, a program designed to help create a pathway for folks coming out of the prison system into higher education. So in 2014, this Lonnie Hancock bill basically allowed community colleges to treat prisons and jails as satellite campuses, right, which is to say, community colleges can go into prisons and jails, teach courses, and the students in those courses, they can get state apportionment for those students, right? So for students in the room, full-time equivalent students, FTES is like how budgets, you know, are often measured in institutions of higher education in the state, and you pay a certain tuition, right, for your education, and the actual cost incurred by the institution to deliver that education to you is much higher than what you pay, right? And so, and that's, you know, in part paid for by some state dollars and other things, right? But in any case, claiming, you know, part of the budget of the institution is tethered to how many full-time equivalent students, right, are taking the courses. And prior to 2014, folks, community colleges couldn't get paid, you know, right, for the work that they did inside because they, you know, for reasons that I won't get into. But in 2014, that situation changed, right? And in the 3 years since then, right, the number of face-to-face college programs has gone from 1 prison to 34, right? So that's a significant, you know, shift. Our programs at the Cal State, they are not publicly funded. That's part of my, you know, role this year is to really advocate to try and make that change in Sacramento. We're a pilot program that's philanthropically funded, and that philanthropic funding comes to an end at the end of this year. And so with pretty modest investments, right, we've had this astronomical growth in access, right, access to credit-bearing college courses for folks in the state prison system. So prior to this, the only thing available, and I know you teach some of these courses, right, are correspondence courses, right? So folks have access to correspondence courses inside, you know, which is, you know, they get their materials, they have no face-to-face, you know, interaction with faculty, and they send their assignments in by mail, and at best can, like, you know, wait the 1 to 2 week turnaround to submit a kind of office hour question and receive it back, right?
We also
So
have video episodes is what they watch, that's their lecture.
sending lecture videos in, yeah,
Examine Life has got 26 episodes, half hour.
yeah,
They show those on DVDs to the students.
right, right.
Proctors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have two classes, I do an ethics and an intro, and each fill up like that,
Yeah.
100 students.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of desire, right? And part of this is partly policy driven too, right? Is that in the last, concurrent with that bill, were policies in the Department of Corrections to give folks credit, right? Which say credit against their sentences if they engage in higher educational programming, right? Yeah.
Get their grade on time so they can get out 2 weeks early.
Yeah.
Incentives, so, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. In the back? Was that a?
No,
All right.
actually, the bill was like, I'm like, at least they're attempting, and I'm like, hopefully they get their stuff together. That's a beautiful thing, period.
Oh, California? Yeah, I mean, so again, this is modest investment. What I'm talking about public resources. So in the CSU, this is private resources, right? Which are not as sustainable, I don't think. But it's just a modest kind of investment, right? Of it still hasn't put a dent in the corrections budget yet, but I'm hopeful, right, that we can retool some of that toward solutions that I think are more constructive and life-affirming. But we can change our priorities. You know what I mean? And I think what's happening in California is increasingly that especially. I mean, I'll put it this way: I'm born and raised in California. I left California when I was 17 and did my undergraduate and graduate work on the East Coast, and then came back and this is historic. There's a historically unprecedented kind of political shift in the political climate, right? It's certainly unprecedented in my lifetime, and I basically just suspended my research agenda to get involved in pushing for systems change in the institutions that I'm affiliated with, because there's this opportunity to really change the course of the state that I'm excited about, and that we're starting to see the fruits of, right? So as a just sort of general kind of claim, right, to start with what I claim that I made at the beginning, this is what philosophy is to me. You know what I mean? It's thinking about perplexing and intractable problems, right, in a creative way with concepts, right, that can change the way that we think about something. One of the things that philosophy has taught me, right, is that asking good questions is more important than having answers, right? And folks have frustration with philosophers about that. And I know that there are folks who fit the stereotypes where they're just like asking questions which are totally unproductive, right? But folks thought that Socrates was like that too, right? But if asking good questions can prevent you from spending years and all kinds of resources and energy trying to get answers to the wrong kinds of questions. You know what I mean? So the prison industrial complex is one of those concepts, right, which I think prompts us to change the way that we think about criminal justice, to be a much more to focus our attention on a much more expansive web of relationships between media conglomerates, multinational corporations, right, and corrections communities, and then the career trajectories of elected politicians. And by seeing that web of relationships, we're then able to conceptualize a different set, right, of responses to the social problems which, in principle, those profit-making kinds of enterprises have arisen to address, right? So that, to me, is philosophical work, and then the actualization, right, of those conceptual innovations in ways that are connecting to communities, right, is very much, I think, part of the philosophical enterprise, right? Because Socrates wasn't just interested in thinking about what piety and morality was, right? I mean, he was he went all the way to death, right? Actually interested in actualizing those principles in the world, right? And I think that's I think this is one of among many examples of ways in which we can make good on philosophical traditions of engagement with world-engaged problems. But anyway, thank you so much for your time.